Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Peter Rao. I'm a senior fellow here and the director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia, and I'm delighted to quarterback today's event, the Iran threat to US-NATO security. This week marks the NATO summit here in Washington, where the president has invited all 31 allied leaders to Washington, along with many other partner heads of government and heads of state from around the world. And so we thought we would tried to bring the Middle East into the discussion since it does not really feature prominently on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization agenda for this week. And for that, we're delighted to have joining us the Honorable Ted Deutch, who represented Broward and Palm Beach counties in Congress for 12 years. He's a native of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, served as chair of the House Ethics Committee, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee, and for these purposes, most relevant, a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he chaired the subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and global counterterrorism. He is now the chief executive officer of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, and was as a founding co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Antisemitism as a congressman, shows a long commitment to Jewish advocacy, to Israel advocacy. We're delighted to have him here, and he will be joined in discussion, along with myself, by Mike Duran, Senior Fellow and Director for our Center on Middle Eastern Peace and Security. Please welcome Ted Deutch to the podium, where he will give a few remarks, and then we will have a conversation for the balance of the time. Congressman, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. Mike, it's good to be here with you. I won't speak long. I will just make this observation. Coming here today, you mentioned the leaders of all the NATO nations, and as a result, roads are blocked off everywhere. The 10-minute ride wound up being about a 20-minute ride and then another 20-minute walk, and I apologize for all the perspiration. But I was thinking, as I was trying to maneuver my way here, that with all of those police and Secret Service agents, I didn't need to worry about myself and my ability to come here to express my views in whatever way I choose. Whereas, in the topic today, on the topic of Iran, simply showing up might trigger, and if you're a woman showing up to protest, might trigger the morality police. And the morality police may make arrests, and those arrests may lead to abuse and to violence and to death. It's only for those of us on this panel and people like you who care about this, think about those kinds of things when you're walking through July heat in Washington to an event like this. But it really struck home of the importance of this. And listen, Peter, the idea that this is not, Iran is not really on the agenda at NATO, I know we'll talk more about. Clearly it should be. I'm honored to be here. For me, this is an issue that I've focused on my entire career. 18 years ago, when I was in the state Senate in Florida, I had conversations when we were trying to be the first state in the country to divest our pension funds from companies who were investing in Iran, oil and gas, helping Iran, contributing to their nuclear program, ultimately the development, their stated goal, the development of nuclear weapons. We had to explain to a lot of people why it was necessary to care about Iran. Then, as Mike well remembers, then for a lot of my colleagues, it was the fact that Floridians, young Floridians, were dying in Iraq at the hands of IEDs coming from Iran. Then, as we had those discussions about pulling our pension funds, which we ultimately did, about $1.5 billion out of those companies investing in Iran, we also made the point that Iran had two goals. One goal was to develop nuclear weapons, and the second goal was to completely create this crescent from Iran through the entire region, ultimately having a greater stake, ultimately control was their aim in Iraq and in Syria, Lebanon with Hezbollah, and obviously their support of Hamas and the other terror groups throughout the regions, and then add the Houthis. That was 18 years ago, and here we sit, and so much of what we were worried about is what we've seen happen. And at the time, and I'll wrap in a minute, at the time, the argument was, well, we have to remember that while we look, and this continued on into my service in Congress, where we worked hard to impose sanctions on Iran and continue to draw the world's attention to their human rights violations and their nuclear program and their support for terror, the argument always was, they're playing the long game. They're thinking about generations. For us, we worry about an election cycle. For them, they worry about the next 1,000 years. It's not about 1,000 years. It's 18 years later. And we've already seen the dramatic steps that they've taken in their ongoing support for terror. We're here 9 months after the horrific attack by Hamas, supported by Iran. We're here just a few months past April 13th and the direct attack by Iran against Israel. We're here at a moment when the Houthis continue to disrupt the entire maritime regime with the support of Iran. So I think this conversation is incredibly timely. I'm honored to be here from our perspective now at AJC. The work that we do is like the work that's done here, like the work that Mike does. We're trying to make sure that these conversations aren't limited to rooms like this, but that our policymakers all understand the moment that we find ourselves at with the amount of enriched uranium that Iran has and the potential to, if they wanted to, within weeks have enough enriched uranium for 5 atomic bombs. And that what we saw happen on October 7th is the goal of Iran everywhere. And that Hezbollah, which we continue to deal with as a secondary issue in so many places, is essentially continuing their onslaught in this low simmering conflict with Israel, launching attack after attack after attack on Israel's north. All of that is happening now, and for the future of not just Israel, but for the future of the United States and the Western world, and most especially this week here in Washington, for the future of NATO and democratic values that the democratic values that NATO seeks to represent and defend. This conversation about Iran is timely, it's important, and I'm really grateful to be here for it. So thank you very much.
Logistics are difficult.
Well, thanks for those remarks, and I'll just start with you. I was so focused on getting your committee assignments correct from your time in Congress that I forgot to say all that much about AJC, which you took over in October of 2022. And sometimes when I, as a Europeanist, travel in Europe, I almost think of the AJC as the foreign ministry of the American Jewish people, because you have offices in Brussels and Berlin and elsewhere. And for that reason, maybe we should just begin with where you began, and that is, why exactly should Europeans bring Iran onto the agenda at a NATO summit? Why should it matter to them, and why should this be up for discussion this week here in Washington?
Well, first there is the big picture reason, right? Which is why NATO exists, and it's a security arrangement, and it's ultimately meant to defend democratic values. Big picture. Specifically, and we might have had an argument, we could have talked about how Iran really threatens those democratic values, and this is something that we should be thinking about and talking about in the context of the Middle East and the war. But no one in Europe needs to stretch, to reach, to make those arguments. If you look at the issue that is items 1, 2, and 3 on the agenda here, which is Ukraine, the Russian onslaught against Ukraine continues with the direct support of the Iranians. And first it was the delivery of these killer drones now and ballistic missiles, and now they're actually producing them in Russia with the support of Iran. Everything that NATO stands for, both theoretically and big picture in the terms that we love to think about in Washington, places like this, when we talk about democracy and democratic values and the Western world, and very specifically what's happening right now on the ground, all of them should compel us to pull the topic of Iran front and center into this. We have, you mentioned AJC, we have offices across Europe, and in every one of those offices, we are advocating every day for a greater focus on Iran, focusing on their nuclear program. The IAEA censure was helpful, not enough, but important, something that we advocated for. At the same time, as an organization that also advocates for Jewish communities, we know the threat that the IRGC poses to Jewish communities. I'm going to Buenos Aires next week. It's the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the AMIA Center that ultimately Iran had its hands in. And we know there's a threat in Europe. If the Europeans are serious about combating anti-Semitism, protecting their own citizens, they should be focused on the IRGC. They should be designating the IRGC the terrorist organization that they are. That's something that we've been advocating for across Europe as well. So there are so many reasons why it's not just an additional topic that would be interesting to put on the agenda here. It's a topic that very much deserves to be in a prominent place on that agenda for all of NATO to be focused on.
Mike, the same question to you.
So you're going to be hard-pressed to find any disagreement between us. It's going to be a very boring agreement here. Of course, I agree with all of that, and I would just fill in some details.
By the way, this was true as a member of Congress, and I haven't lost that. So I would offer comments, and then really smart people like Mike would fill in the details. So thank you for that.
Well, not that you wouldn't have filled them in yourself. It's just I have a little bit of time here to develop the ideas a bit further. There was an intelligence failure, I think, in Israel on October 7th. We know this, but there's been a huge intelligence failure in the US military and in NATO with respect to Iran. Nobody saw the rise of the missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles of the Iranians coming. And when to the extent that it's a very interesting thing because we had all of the information there. If you go back and you look at the DIA reports about the Iranian ballistic missiles program, you can see that we knew it was being developed under Klieg lights. We knew it was there, but we didn't understand that it was a threat because we interpreted it as, I'm saying we, our military, European militaries, they interpreted it as a compensation for the lack of an air force, because Iran doesn't have a conventional military to speak of, and so they thought of the missile systems as a kind of poor man's air force that they would use for homeland defense, and no one recognized the offensive capabilities that these represented, and they also didn't recognize how the great importance that the Iranians put on these weapons. So they had one of the first drone programs in the Middle East. They have a very sophisticated program now. They are distributing these weapons to all of their proxies, and as Ted said, they are now supplying the Russians, and they are actually a factor in the balance of power in Europe. Nobody saw it coming, and they're still not thinking about it, which is or very late to the game. These drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles can overwhelm the defenses of any actor in the world, including the United States. They can overwhelm the interceptors, and they can overwhelm the sensors. This is a huge burden. So when in Ukraine now, we have the air defense assets are expensive and they are limited. So the Ukrainians have had to move them to protect the cities. They've had to move them away from the front lines, and so some of the frontline troops are not protected. As time goes on, it becomes a big financial burden to try to answer these weapons. This is true for the Ukrainians. It's true for the Israelis. What we need to see, the Russians and the Iranians. I would add the Chinese to this too, but let's keep it simple. The Russians and the Iranians are in an alliance to undermine the US-led international order in Europe and in the Middle East. And I would add Africa as well, but let's just keep it simple. The Russians and the Iranians are allies in Syria. Russians and the Iranians are allies in Ukraine. They're using the same tactics, techniques, weapons in both places, and the goal is exactly the same.
When and I'll stay with you, Mike, on this, speak to Europeans, They will treat, for example, the war in Gaza as a discrete theater. Then they will talk about the challenges in the north, so Lebanon, Israel. There's the Houthi complex in the Red Sea. There's terrorism and militias in Iraq and in Syria. And each of these are almost pieces of a puzzle, but the puzzle is never really put together. You have a different view in that I think you've used the metaphor of the hip bone connected to the thigh bone, et cetera, et cetera. How should we envision the region? How should we help our friends and partners in Europe think about the region and how to look at it?
Our adversaries are ahead of us in a number of ways. We have a couple of blind spots, and you just alluded to one or described one of them. We need to see a pattern of power, and we have to see ourselves as a U.S.-led coalition against a Russian-Iranian coalition, which includes all of Iran's proxies, and we have to see that as a conflict that is going on in multiple theaters. There's a Western tendency, and I don't know exactly where it comes from, though, to treat each of these, each geographic area, not just each country, as a different case, like a lawyer would. You have the Ukraine case, you have the Syria case, you have the Yemen case, you have the Gaza case, and to address each one as if it is there are totally different factors at work, when really it's the same conflict in all of them, or at least strategically, that's what we should be seeing. Is what connects all of them. And the other mistake we make is which is what I was driving at before, Americans tend to do this. I think NATO probably does it as well. We always imagine if we go to war, this is what our military does. They think if we go to war, we the United States go to war against Iran, we will wipe the floor with them. Because our military, if we tot up all of the assets that we have in our military and we tot up all the assets that the Iranians have, we will crush them. And we think of it as a war as a military-to-military conflict, rather than an ongoing, continuous geostrategic competition. If we think of it as a competition, then the Iranians are actually gaining territory, gaining positions of strength. That are shocking given the actual power disbalance. Is that a word, disbalance? It isn't. Imbalance is the word. The power imbalance, the hard power imbalance that objectively exists. We can't count on that. We have to engage in the geostrategic competition.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to add one other place to, Mike rightly points out Iran and Russia working together, Ukraine, Iran, and Russia working together in Syria. There's another battlefield where Iran and Russia are working closely together, and it's the one that directly impacts and, in fact, is currently part of a conflict with Europe and the United States, and that's online, and it's cyber, and it's social media. The armies. What the Russians want, what the Iranians are now allies with them in trying to achieve, is to try to sow distrust around the world. And in the context of elections that are taking place, it's Iranian bots and Russian misinformation, disinformation working together that is ongoing even as the hot wars are happening. This is happening in ways that so often is unseen. We acknowledge it every once in a while, but it's happening day after day after day. And as we head into election season here, I think we should expect to see more of it. And in Europe, on the cyber front, again, it's not a question of when. I mean, you can talk to the Estonians, you can talk to other Europeans about efforts that the Russians have made, again, now in concert with Iran there as well.
As a congressman from Florida, I thought you were going to say Latin America, but instead you went to the cyber domain. Let me...
well, we're at NATO, but I'm happy to talk about Latin
sure
America.
You would be, yeah. Let me ask, since you brought up nuclear weapons and Iran's nuclear weapons program in your remarks, we seem to be tantalizingly close to an Iranian nuclear weapon. Do you think we're still committed to stopping Iran going nuclear? And what would be the implications if they did go nuclear?
Well, on your first question, I mean it's a question that's in many ways impossible to answer. Yeah, we're committed. We can all say we're committed until Iran has a nuclear weapon, and then we weren't that committed. And that's not a position that we want to be in. I don't think it's a position that we can afford to be in. Obviously, and again, these are conversations that we've been having for years and years. But the argument always was, well, think about what Iran is doing now, everything we've been talking about. Now think about Iran in position of doing that with nuclear weapons. In many ways, the argument, the scenario has progressed well beyond that. Those were conversations we were having when they were enriching uranium to low levels, and now they're within just a small step of 90% enrichment, weapons grade uranium. We know what would happen if Iran had nuclear weapons, and some of this is clear. The ability, whether they would use it or not, I'm going to be interested to hear Mike's views, but we know that those concerns are valid. We know that Hamas, backed by an Iranian Iran, and Hezbollah, backed by an Iranian Iran, would pose an even greater threat. But we also, again, being here this week, if you look at the purpose of NATO, the question is, add Iran to the mix, Iran with a nuclear weapon, that could then bring NATO allies in. What happens to the way that NATO approaches these issues if Iran too has nuclear weapons? I think, it's the last word on this, I think we should be speaking, the United States especially, should be taking the lead and speaking very clearly about what the threat of a nuclear armed Iran would be, about what we're prepared to do to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons, and should be drawing in the support of our European allies. And now, so often, it seems that some of our European allies are the ones who are really pushing. There needs to be greater alignment in a strong response, particularly at a time when inflation in Iran is increasing, when the threats to the regime, as we see in occasional protests, continue to increase. Now is the time to focus on standing against that nuclear program because of what it's doing now to Iran and the Iranian economy and the Iranian people as they pursue that against everything else, and what it would mean if they ultimately had it.
Paradoxically, Iran is weakening and strengthening at the same time.
Exactly right.
Mike Duran, on the question of nuclear Iran, are we entirely opposed to Iran going nuclear until we present a fait accompli to the American people and say they have gone nuclear? What else can we do?
Yeah, we're entirely opposed to it, but can't really show what we're doing to prevent it. And I think if we had President Biden here and we gave him truth serum and he was to say what he truly believes, and I think the same would be true of Barack Obama if we had him here, he'd say, you know, listen, I asked myself a question. I can't prove this, obviously, but this is how I imagine it to be. I asked myself a question: what would be worse, taking massive military action to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, or allowing Iran to go nuclear? And I decided that it would be worse for the United States to take military action. That is where I think they really are, and which means that at some point we're going to go, oops, they got a bomb. Because every red line, they've been very careful never to set a red line, actually. The Israelis tried to impose a red line. Prime Minister Netanyahu did in 2012. It didn't work. They've blown past what he said was his red line. They did, and the Israelis didn't enforce it. The Americans have been very careful. At each stage, whenever Iran arrives at a new achievement from their point of view, we shift the definition of what we need to prevent. So there was this quote from General Milley, former chief of staff. I remember it caused a little bit of a stir, where he said, our goal is to prevent Iran from having a fielded nuclear weapon. So not to prevent them from having a nuclear weapon, not to prevent them from testing, but making sure it isn't fielded. So then what does fielded mean? At a certain point, we're going to get to the stage where we're saying, okay, they have a nuclear weapon, but it hasn't actually been loaded onto the planes. The goal of our policy is to keep it from being loaded onto the planes. Then once it's loaded onto the planes, we'll say, the goal of our policy is to keep the planes from actually taking off. Those planes can't take off. They're really, okay, they have a nuclear weapon, but it doesn't really pose a threat. But while that's going on, they already benefit from a lot right now by inching forward, inching forward, inching forward. They benefit from having a nuclear weapon. They get the same benefits from the program that is close to fielding a weapon that they would have from a fielded weapon, which is not to say I don't think they want to field a weapon. I think they will. They'll get there unless we stop them. But if you just think about the war in Gaza right now, and everything else that's gone on, the arrival of Iranian drones and having a significant impact in Ukraine, a lot of the terrorist actions that the Iranians have backed in Europe and in North America, none of those have sparked a significant policy response from the United States. We have a whole suite of things that we do that make us look like we're doing something when we're not really. We issue sanctions against individuals who are not affected in any way by the sanctions, and the sanctions don't affect Iran's ability to do anything seriously, as opposed to doing something serious. Serious economic sanctions like preventing oil sales to China or taking military action against them or harming their interests in some very significant way. One of the reasons the administration does not want to do that, and there are a number, but one of them is they're fearful that they will race toward building a bomb, building 3 to 5 bombs in very short order. And that's why we don't have snapback, and that's why we didn't do anything about to prevent the international ban on ballistic missile sales from lapsing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I would just add to that. The conversation, in many ways, when the conversation was about the JCPOA, there was and this is, the way this is played out, I think is surprising, but conversation was about the JCPOA. Yes, it was about whether it was a good deal or not, but there was a focus on the nuclear program. And it's complicated, and so but people spent a lot of time talking about low-enriched uranium and what it means to go to higher enriched, and they went to 60, and ultimately they got to 60, and then the fact that the jump is much, much greater, that first piece, and then the additional steps that you have to go to get to weapons grade is so much less. Those conversations happened in the context of JCPOA. We pulled out of the JCPOA, and then the conversation has really just been about sanctions, and somehow it seems like we've lost. We're having this conversation about sanctions almost as if sanctions were the issue, instead of sanctions as a means of stopping Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and all of the things that we knew would happen. We haven't even talked about what happens in the region if Iran gets a nuclear weapon and everyone else wants the protection of a nuclear weapon. And lastly, the IAEA, if the non-proliferation regime that in particular our European friends speak so passionately about, if the nuclear non-proliferation regime in the IAEA is going to have any authority, if they're going to be deemed a serious effort to address proliferation issues around the world, then you can't simply allow Iran from meeting to meeting to express the willingness to allow in some inspectors only to kick them out just after the meeting, and express a willingness to do a little more only to change their mind and kick the can down the road. The Director General of the IAEA knows this. He's been very clear about what Iran is doing, and only countries who want nuclear weapons have behaved the way that Iran behaves. He's telling us, the IAEA professionals are telling us, but the member states need to act.
Yeah, one other, I think, direct implication for NATO would be proliferation if Iran actually goes nuclear, including potentially, I can think of at least one NATO member state that might be interested in its own nuclear weapon. Let's move to Israel because it strikes me.
Sorry, can I interrupt you?
Yes, you can.
That was a reference to Turkey, was it?
Was, yeah.
Okay.
Let's move to Israel because as we're discussing Iran policy, it seems to me like we don't really have an Iran policy, or maybe the Iran policy is to extinguish the war in Gaza first, and then hopefully that catalyzes some sort of process thereafter. And when it comes to Israel, Mike, you got at this a little bit about the detrimental economics of focusing on a defense-dominant regime and trying to take on Iranian cheap drones with expensive interceptors, et cetera. So that might be one lesson, but perhaps I'll just stick with you, Congressman. What are some of the lessons that Europe and the US can learn from Israel? And I don't just mean the war in Gaza, but what are some of the ways in sort of sharing best practices or innovation and high-tech clusters that we see, for example, around Tel Aviv that Europeans could pick up from and help improve NATO as an alliance as it goes forward? What does Israel have to offer, in other words, to take the discussion a little bit away from Iran and towards Israel for NATO and the United States?
Yeah, well, look, some of this we've seen play out in the course of the war. I think Israel becoming a part of CENTCOM, which for coordination, military coordination, defense coordination purposes, we thought would be important. I think what we saw on April 13th when Iran attacked Israel and the way that European allies and allies from the region stepped forward to defend Israel, whether they were doing it, whether the stated reason was to defend Israel or to defend their territorial integrity, it doesn't matter. That's, I think, a direct result of that move from Israel into CENTCOM. We should build on that. I think the way to build on, in terms of what Israel has to offer in the region from a security standpoint, this conversation is and needs to be a part of the conversation about Saudi normalization for all of the benefits that would come, I believe, from Saudi normalizing with Israel, creating the clear line between the U.S., Israel, and the Gulf states who stand with them on the one side, and Iran and its terror proxies on the other. The war should remind us that goal is something that we should continue to work toward. That's number one. I also think that so the flip side of that is the war, and I think Mike, you referred to it as Star Wars versus Mad Max in this war. The other thing that we should learn is, even as the importance of Israel's technology, Israel's defense capabilities have been recognized, and both within the region and outside the region, expanding the Abraham Accords, bringing in other countries from Asia and Europe to be more directly a part of that. For all these reasons, all of that's important. At the same time, what happened on October 7th was not something that Hamas and Iran accomplished because of their high-tech capability. To the contrary, what we learned from what I think we have to learn from this is that all of the technology and that Israel possesses was not enough to stop what happened. And I know there will be inquiry and we'll get more information, but going forward, I think how to deal with the very real threat of these kinds of large-scale terror attacks has to be something that they focus on together. And it's, again, getting back to Iran, the IRGC and the IRGC's efforts to target Jewish community in particular around the world, not only in Israel, is something that Europe and the US should and Israel should be working very closely on preventing, and I think can learn a lot from what's transpired since 10/7.
The Iranians recently, in the last 6-10 months, have downed, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but 5 or 6 Israeli drones, and they've downed Turkish, I'm saying not Iranians, Iran and its proxies have downed Israeli drones, Turkish drones, and American drones. And they have engaged forces from around the region. And each one of those proxies has an Iranian technical team working with them, taking all the data back to Iran, which is going to make Iranian systems more and more sophisticated in dealing with America and all of its allies, with the systems of American systems and all of the allied systems. Especially now that Iran has this relationship with Russia, so they're also getting technical help from the Russians. So we're going to see in the next couple of years a real explosion of Iranian capabilities that we haven't anticipated, we haven't thought about it, we're not countering in any way, and that's it's going to explode because of all that data that they're taking in, and it's not just. It's especially valuable data because it's data that is collected in combat conditions and in all weather conditions and so forth. But they're also, in doing this, they're hanging out their shingle, and they have a line of people, of countries that want to buy their equipment. So they are either delivering it to or talking to the Algerians, to the Venezuelans, to the Armenians. They say in their propaganda that they have 20 some odd countries lining up. I don't know if that's true, they lie a lot, but is it 10 or is it 21? Either way, what that means is there's going to be revenue coming in to improve their system, and even more data as those systems go out and the Iranian teams collect it. The Israelis are after us, but maybe even more than us, they are the single most experienced adversary of the Iranians, and their knowledge, their systems is going to be invaluable to the Western alliance in dealing with this as this problem grows. The administration, I think, has made a mistake. You know, we talked earlier about this tendency to talk about Gaza as if it's disconnected from Ukraine, as if it has nothing to do with Iraq or Syria and so on, Yemen. This looking at each thing as a discrete file, it leads to, I think, a lot of strategic mistakes eventually. And the administration has defined the conflict in Gaza from the beginning as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that's a complete misconception of what it is. It's objectively not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or simply an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On October 8th, Hezbollah opened up against Israel. Shortly after that, we had the Houthis, and of course we have the militias in Iraq and Syria. At the very least, this is, and then on April 12th, 13th, we had the unprecedented barrage of ballistic missiles against Israel by Iran itself. So at the very least, it's objectively an Iranian-Israeli war. But the way I see it is it's an Iranian campaign against the American-led alliance system. And that's how we need to frame it.
Let me press you on that, because I think it's almost undeniable, or at least we have broad bipartisan consensus in Washington, that there is a revisionist axis, however you want to describe it, a Russia backed by China, at least its defense industrial base and military reconstitution depends upon China, DPRK being involved in North Korea, Northeast Asia, and Iran in the Middle East, taking on the American-led international system. And I would think that the natural reflex, or the natural response would be, there's an axis forming that's crystal clear. It's taking on American allies, a partner in Ukraine, an ally in Israel. We should fully move in behind both of them and show no daylight between them. And in a way, I think you could argue that in Ukraine, we are backing the Ukrainians against Iranian attacks with support of, supporting Russia attacks on the eastern flank of NATO and into Ukraine itself. The Middle East, I'd say there's a bit of daylight between either us and the Israelis, or there is more conversation or more official statements to that respect from European capitals and even Washington. What explains that? Why isn't the natural inclination just to move? It's perhaps a bit of a philosophical question, but why not move in fully behind Israel and just stay there? Or am I misreading our policy?
No, I don't think you are. But let me disagree slightly with your premise. Although I don't disagree with the big picture, but with one of the little details I think is important, is that you said we are opposing Iran in Ukraine. We're not.
Well,
we're not. In the sense that we have done nothing to make Iran pay a price for what. I mean, this was a major geostrategic move by the Iranians to become a significant factor. And the supply of the drones to the Russians was not an insignificant step. The Russians had a real vulnerability. They didn't have a long-range strike capability. And the Iranians stepped up and filled it for them at a moment when they were at their weakest in the war. So it's had a real impact on the battlefield.
yeah.
They paid no price for it, none. You can't point to any significant European or American policy that was designed to make the Iranians think twice about that initiative. So the real issue, I think, is why is it that we are so hesitant to make the Iranians pay a price for anything they do, whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe? Edward Luttwak pointed out after the April 12th, 13th barrage from Iran against Israel that there's now a Biden doctrine which says that because the United States restrained Israel on both ends of the thing. They restrained Israel from when the Iranians were putting the missiles on the launchers. The Americans restrained Israel from attacking Iran. And when after Iran attacked, President Biden, of course, told Netanyahu to take the win and don't retaliate. And the United States itself, when dealing with Iran, has been very careful not to retaliate against Iranians in Yemen, in Iraq, or in Syria, and certainly not against Iran proper. We have never, under any administration since Reagan, we have not taken action directly against Iranians. So Luttwak said he called it the Biden doctrine, is that Iran can attack any country with drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, but no one, including the United States, is allowed to attack Iran back. It's it's remarkable, really, especially given, as you pointed out earlier, how weak Iran is. Iran is such an odd country. It's like a boxer who has a terrible heart condition and has worked really hard with one arm, has one big bicep, and the other arm is kind of atrophied.
Yeah, I remember during the COVID crisis, these bizarre pictures of them spraying down the streets. We were like, "What are we dealing with here? I thought this was a sophisticated place."
Well, look at the death of Raisi. This old decrepit helicopter, and they put both the foreign minister and the president in the helicopter, and at the same time, and they had to have the Turks come in with the Turkish drone to actually find the wreckage. So on the one hand, it was quite technologically backward, but on the other hand, it does have this big bicep it has developed. But if we wanted to cause them pain and make them pay a price for what they're doing, we could do it without that much risk to ourselves. But I'm sorry, I see you want to move on, but I want to talk, Peter.
I know you do.
I want to talk. Okay, just one last.
Professor Duran, the floor is yours.
Oh, that was a real low blow. He knows I really can't stand being called professor. Just for that, I'm going to talk even more. No, just one last sentence. I think if we had the senior Biden officials here, and they told the truth, they would say that yes, there is this alignment, Russia, China, Iran, but if we go hard against Iran, we push Iran closer to them. We can actually, our policy of what they would see it as strategic flexibility, not tying ourselves too closely to the Israelis, being able to negotiate between the two of them. That's a way of actually pulling Iran toward us and away from China.
There's a couple thoughts. If they were here, I don't think, it's interesting, I don't think that they would claim that they're intentionally trying to not draw close to the Israelis. And I think but they would also likely acknowledge that growing alliance and a commitment to do something about it. And we can argue whether it's enough and how they're going about it. But it's interesting the way that this war has been described. I think the Israel as a Israel-Palestinian conflict, as part of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it does a couple of things. One, this is a war between Israel and Hamas, but that's also not appropriate. It's insufficient to describe what's actually happening. And if you couch it in those terms, then then you invite, if it's Israel and the Palestinians, then you invite the anti-Israel, the anti-Zionists, the anti-Semites to flood out onto college campuses and 4th of July celebrations and elsewhere to take a stand. They get a twofer. They get to stand against Israel and they get to stand against the United States, which they also hate. And as part of viewing it through that lens, when you view it as the challenge of this growing axis and what it means for America, I think it's easier in some ways to maintain the strong bipartisan consensus that you referred to. But the other thing that we haven't talked about is that portion of the far right that doesn't believe that investing in an alliance to push back against that growing Iran, Russia, China axis, that investing is necessary, that we really should be focused internally, that the ongoing efforts in Ukraine are enough, that it's enough money, it's enough attention, we have to focus here. That bipartisan consensus, and I don't want to leave this on a even more negative note, but that bipartisan consensus that you describe, I really worry about the ability to sustain that going forward because of the voices on the extremes and losing the ability to maintain that center.
Let me ask you about anti-Semitism then in the U.S. and since AJC is very active abroad, also in Europe. Are they the same phenomenon? How similar are anti-Semitic movements, ideologies, ways of processing the world in the U.S. as compared to Europe as you see it?
Well, I mean, first of all, the phenomenon is not, it didn't start in the 2010s in Europe, and it didn't start on 10/8 when people flooded into the streets long before a single IDF soldier went into Gaza to defend Israel. Those protesters on that first day were there for one reason, that was to celebrate the Hamas terror attacks. But neither one of those was the start of anti-Semitism. It's millennia old. There's a long history of anti-Semitism that over years has caused Jews to, has led to persecution, has led to Jews fleeing countries, being chased from countries. Obviously, the worst example is the attempted annihilation of the entire Jewish people. That's important to remember. That said, in the 21st century, we saw this increase in anti-Semitism in Europe. AJC worked with other groups and really worked to help create this IRA definition of anti-Semitism 2013. We thought it was really important to be able to identify this contemporary form of anti-Semitism so that the world could come together to do something to fight it. And this was after the terror attacks in Paris and in Toulouse and in Copenhagen and across Europe. And when I was a member of Congress, I remember we held an event, our anti-Semitism caucus held an event here in Washington with the ambassadors from our our allies who were experiencing this dramatic rise, just to show support for them, because it was impossible to imagine what was happening with these violent attacks, and that was before the deadliest attack on the community here in Pittsburgh, and then Poway and Colleyville and Muncie and Jersey City, and now these attacks that we see play out on a regular basis. The similarity, yes, there are similarities in what we're seeing happening around the world right now. One, since 10/7, we've seen this dramatic spike in anti-Semitism on the far left in the anti-Zionist world. This is something that doesn't just concern us. I think it should, as I referenced earlier, I think it should concern everyone who is committed to democracy. When there are crowds, huge crowds in some instances, out chanting, calling for the destruction of Israel, tearing down American flags, burning Israeli flags. This is something we have to confront, not just in Europe, but here as well. We worry about the political implications of this with elections that we just saw in France, which we could spend an hour talking about. And then at the same time, we have to be focused on the anti-Semitism of the far right, which before 10/7 was what was generating most of the attention, and the anti-Semitic flyers and the conspiracy theories and the old-time, more traditional Jew hatred that we also need to combat. And then add to that this really dangerous and violent Islamist anti-Semitism, and it creates this really dangerous situation for the Jewish community. It's the reason that that we worked so hard to help elevate the position of Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism in the State Department that Deborah Lipstadt, I think, magnificently serves in. It's the reason that the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism was important, but there needs to be someone who is focused all of the time thinking about how to take action at the government level, and then it requires a whole of society approach all around the world working together. We just had our global forum, and dozens of countries, leaders from dozens of Jewish community in dozens of countries stood together to call for action across society. And the one thing, I'll finish with this, the one thing that we know for sure is that anti-Semitism never stops at the Jews. It means that there is something gnawing at the core of society, and if we allow it to continue and we allow it to fester and to build, and we don't respond, and there's no accountability, and people sit by, and the police don't take action, and the district attorneys don't enforce the law. If we allow that to happen, it doesn't go away on its own. It only gets worse, and it is ultimately not just the Jews, but it is all of society. It is democracy that is at stake, and it is not over dramatic to say that, because we have seen this throughout history. It's why the world needs to stand together against anti-Semitism and in support of our shared values.
That's the canary in the coal mine.
Always.
Mike Duran, same question.
I agree with all of that, and I thought that Ted was going to say when he was talking about the protesters on campus, that if we define this as this conflict in Gaza as Iran versus the United States, then those protesters are not, it's not just we have to put together a bipartisan consensus against it, but those protesters go from being human rights activists to being a fifth column of the enemy of the United States, which is what I believe they are, actually. I mean, maybe fifth column may be a little bit strong, but we
need a good headline for
okay, there you go. Fifth column on our campuses. We have, but these are terror supporters, and they are anti-American. It's not the burning of American flags is not incidental to the program. But we have terror supporters on our campus who are being nurtured by our campuses, and that is not a good thing for the United States. Regardless of what it is for Israel, it's not good for Israel. It's not good for the United States. Period. But if we don't define the thing correctly from the beginning, then we can't talk about it in that way and understand the full threat that it represents. Anti-Semitism is anti-Americanism, and if we look at it on our campuses, but also globally, the movement against Israel is at its heart a movement to undermine the American-led order. We have to see Israel is on the front lines fighting for the United States and for Europe. And I wish our leaders were saying that more clearly.
And if you, the images back this up. If you make this about Israel and the Palestinians, then I think what Mike said is right. If you make this, as everyone tries to point out, I mean, every right-thinking person tries to point out, this is a war that Hamas started. This is, Hamas continues to hold hostages. Hamas is responsible and could end this war if they lay down their weapons and return the hostages. And if you're out marching in support, if you are protesting in support of Hamas, then you're supporting a terrorist group, which for most people would be enough to make them back off of that support. Instead, look at the images. We make that point, rightfully so, and then you see people waving Hamas flags and wearing Palestinian Islamic Jihad headbands on campus. So it's not even enough to point out what is obvious, that if you're marching, calling for the destruction of Israel in its entirety, Palestine from the river to the sea, globalize the Intifada, which is a call for terror. If you're doing that, this is not about advocating a political position or standing up for the Palestinians. It's about advocating for terror. But even that doesn't seem to be enough to deter much of what we've seen, which is why on campuses, for example, every college should be very clear, going back as they prepare for the fall term, every college should be looking at their codes of student conduct. They should be revising their codes of student conduct. It should be clear what the repercussions are when students on campus take action to harass and threaten, intimidate, and attempt to silence one group on campus, the way that we saw in the spring. And then it needs to be clear how they're going to ensure that there is accountability when it's violated. And that simply sitting back, as many university presidents have done, and are just hoping that maybe now, between now and the start of the fall semester, maybe there will be a deal, and maybe the hostages will come home, and maybe the world, and then things will go back to the way they were before, that they'll go back to normal. What existed before was not normal, and there is a tremendous amount that universities need to do, not just in the fall semester, but going forward to both keep Jewish students safe and to make sure that the whole enterprise of universities as a place where every voice is heard and welcomed and hard conversations can take place, to make sure that that actually continues to be viable in the United States.
Yeah, instead it seems like we've just been on the defensive rather than going on offense. And I would submit that I think Israel's been outmaneuvered, and supporters of Israel in a lot of the information domains, I mean, the opponents of Israel have really done a masterful job of putting poison into social media and elsewhere. And to the point, Mike correcting my premise earlier, I think what I would say, or what I wanted to say is, President Biden will be briefing to the NATO allies the peace plan for the Middle East. He's not going to be briefing a peace plan on Ukraine. And it just shows how, if we get the framing right, we could potentially stay on offense rather than having to go on defense. But we've run out of time. We'll do the hour on the French elections next time. Ted Deutch, a real pleasure to have you at Hudson.
Thank you very much.
Always great to be on stage with you. Please join us at hudson.org for more programming. Welcome to NATO Week, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thanks.